January 20th, 2024, 5 p.m. This is our Board of Education study session. We will begin by indicating who's here. Kim, will you start?
Kim Chandler.
Julie Jackson.
Connie Burgess.
Mark Nelson.
Karen Winter. Chris Wynn.
Rich Nye.
Todd Huber.
And Nicole McDermott. All right. First up, we do have a short consent agenda. We've had this for a couple days and have been able to ask any questions. With that, I'll entertain a motion.
I move that we approve the consent agenda. I'll second.
All right, we have a motion and a second to approve the consent agenda. Any discussion? All in favor, please say aye.
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 Any opposed? Thank you. We do also have an action item, which is the bond resolution. Just as a reminder, this is the one that we talked about in January as we are redoing the bond and will save us approximately $600,000 over the life of the bond. Todd, did you have something to add?
I think you just covered it for me. But in your packet, you do have the resolution that will authorize us to go to market with the bond, and that's really about it. I have with us, we have Dale Okerlund and Nate with LRB Financial Advisors. We have Brandon Johnson with who are you with, Brandon? I forgot already. Brandon, thank you. That's our bond counsel. So if you have any detailed questions, I'll defer to them really quick.
Are there any questions? Everyone's good? Okay, with that, I'll entertain a motion then.
A move that we accept, is this just the bond resolution?
Mm-hmm. The resolution providing the issuance and sale of general obligation refund bond series.
Noted.
Oh, I'll second it.
Okay, we have a motion and a second that we accept the resolution providing for the issuance and sale of the general obligation refund bond series. Any further discussion? All in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Right. Perfect. You guys are awesome. Thank you. All right, which takes us to the main part of our study session today, and we're going to turn the time over to Rick and Sherry. Sherry, thanks for being here.
Good evening, Board. I have Sherry Sorensen with me here, Associate Director of Curriculum Instruction, to help me with any technical questions that might come up. I can refer to her. She'll bail me out. Let me just work through the slide deck here. Just again, some introductory slides, reminders on Graduate of Granite. Where DLI would fit into this presentation is under our academic priority, under the objective of personalized competency-based learning. We have an action within that objective of offering specialized courses. Just as a reminder as to where DLI lands, Sherry reports to Noelle Converse, who's in curriculum and instruction. Objectives for this presentation is quickly, you've heard before, but it doesn't hurt to have a reminder on a summary of dual language immersion and best practices, providing a summary of what that looks like in Granite, describing some benefits, the challenges, and providing a recommendation. February of last year, we did a similar presentation explaining some of the challenges that we have. So some of this, again, is perhaps a little bit of a repeat. We did not come strong with a recommendation in that presentation, and this evening we will. Again, DLI best practices is having two teachers, one that's teaching a target language and the other teaching English, focusing on environment, materials, and equally splitting instructional time. So if Sherry and I are those two teachers, I would teach the target language, Sherry would teach English, and we would swap kids. Instructional time, whenever in the target language, only the target language is spoken, promoting high levels of proficiency. Where this works best, obviously, is when you have a great culture, when you have great traditions, where you have two teachers who are highly qualified and good at what they do. Summary of DLI and Granite, we have 11 elementary schools. The bulk of those are Spanish DLI. We do have Chinese and French. A simple way to put that is one Chinese on the west side, one on the east, one French on the east side, one French on the west side as well. The cluster of our Spanish tend to be on the west side. Not tend, are on the west side. Wanted to highlight for you when you start looking closely at the data in terms of students who elect to attend a DLI school, across the board averaged across these 11 schools, 65% are in boundary, 35% of students are out of boundary. Now that varies slightly from school to school. That's the average across all 11. Benefits again is learning a second language, connections with culture, diversity, cognitive benefits of learning another language, similar to learning an instrument. College credit as a student progresses into high school, starting with AP and then concurrent enrollment classes in that target language. It does provide an opportunity for some specialized courses. And in the elementary side, when you're splitting subjects, there's reduced preparation for an elementary teacher if they're only teaching half of the subjects. I want to talk Granite specific challenges, and again, this won't come as news to you. We have not necessarily a DLI problem, but a challenge of declining enrollment, and we have some small school concerns, and the board has heard those several times. I just bulleted them here in this slide. I want to talk what that means for DLI and DLI specific challenges. And I bolded that. It's really, the bottom line is scheduling and staffing. When we have student attrition, so what tends to happen across is you end up with, let's say, 30 students in first grade, and by the time they're in fifth grade, just because you're not having in fifth grade students move in who can have the proficiency level needed, you end up with some smaller class sizes in those higher grades. Which then means some imbalance between the DLI and the traditional classes just due to that attrition factor. And we try and mitigate that a little bit by taking more DLI students and having some high class size early on in DLI in the lower grades. But just due to moving in and out or parent decisions around maintaining the program or not results in smaller DLI class size in upper grades. Sometimes there can be some behavior issues when you have students who are together every year, year after year. And they get really familiar with each other and know how each other works, and sometimes that can be great and sometimes it cannot. Another challenge becomes PLCs, or teacher professional learning communities in small schools. That's true of all small schools when you start only having 2 teachers per grade level. But DLI, because of the nature of teaching different subjects, can create some singleton kind of problems as well. Or even if we had 4 teachers, we're not all teaching the same subject per se because of that DLI switch. Again, just highlighting the biggest area of challenge is scheduling and staffing. What we want to focus on tonight, and we didn't really focus on this specifically last year when we talked DLI, is it's becoming very clear that the challenge with DLI is when a school gets small enough that there's only one traditional class. And that comes with several things that can come into play with one traditional class. But I'm just here highlighting that class size is our biggest challenge when we only have one traditional class, and that flip-flop that happens over time as students move along into the upper grades. Wanted to highlight DLI variations, and this is what we spent quite a bit of time on last year. These are all solutions that we use to address scheduling and staffing problems. So I've highlighted 3 solutions that we use and given them names. The one teacher solution. This is where a teacher teaches both English and the target language in a single classroom. So let's say I am the Spanish DLI teacher and we don't have enough students, or we don't have enough students where I can flip-flop with someone else, I just keep my same kids, and in the morning, I only speak Spanish to them, and then in the afternoon, I speak English. Vertical split solution is another type of solution that we'll use, and that's when I might be the Spanish DLI teacher, and I teach second grade in the morning, and then third grade in the afternoon. And that's where the splitting is happening. I'm basically teaching two different grades in the target language. A third solution that we use, this is usually when we have at least 3 teachers per grade, and that's regrouping. So the idea behind regrouping is mixing up some of our students so they're not necessarily, the students aren't together all the time. So between 3 teachers, we would rotate students a little bit in their English time so that the students might not always be together. So a look of that, and Sherry can help me here, would be 3 teachers again. Let's say there's 2 traditional and 1 DLI teacher. The DLI teacher has the DLI kids, and we play with the schedule a little bit, so some of those DLI go to their traditional part at one point in the day, and the other go to their traditional part at another time in the day with 2 different teachers. It's a little bit of just trying to break up the kid dynamic.
Can you clarify, Rick, there, is that still a half day? I mean,
Correct.
Or is it broken up into portions of the day?
It's both. It's portions of the day equating to half a day.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, but not necessarily one.
50-50.
Yeah, or not necessarily one time period that represents that half a day. It's not necessarily the afternoon, for example. It might be an hour and a half in the morning and an hour and a half in the afternoon that are in the English portion. No? Okay.
I'll have Sherry.
So it's traditional with the language teacher in that they would have half of the students in DLI for half the day and the other half for the other half of the day. But during the English portion of the day, the kids would be regrouped. But you would still have those blocks of dual immersion language time.
Thanks.
Yeah, so thank you, Sherry, for helping clarify in my mind as well. DLI teacher looks the same. The 2 traditional are swapping some kids in how they're working. So if we're naming having only 1 traditional class as the challenge, is the dilemma, I have 3 different possible solutions for consideration, and I have pros and cons of each, and then I have a recommendation as well, or some guidelines or some parameters and a recommendation. So here are the 3 solutions that were considered. Leveraging granite variations to create more than 1 traditional. So what you can do again is you can go to 1 teacher vertical solutions as well, and essentially cap how many students you take in the target language, thus forcing more than 1 traditional. So again, if you have 3 teachers, you cap, we're only going to allow this many kids in DLI, therefore everyone else is in traditional. Another solution is just to supplement schools that are small schools with extra FTE to create more than 1 traditional. And I have pros and cons to that. Consolidate is the third solution. Consolidate DLI programs to create more than 1 traditional. And let me walk you through each of those. Continue with variations. The pro of that is it seems to be working in some locations, so there's not a lot of change cost if that's continued. It works as a pro, and this is where it starts getting a little complicated. It could be leveraged to have more than 1 traditional, as long as it's not a small school. As long as you have at least 3 teachers per grade, you can throttle or cap that DLI number and push to 2. But if it's too small of a school, that doesn't work. The other problem is, remember I showed you the averages were 65% in boundary, 35% out. So what is a little bit of an unknown is if you do cap that DLI class, does that mean you actually don't carry 2 traditional because you're not bringing in 35% of out-of-boundary kids? That's a little bit of an unknown as to what would happen if you capped that DLI and didn't have out-of-boundary coming in. Cons there is just what I said. It may require a cap to the DLI, and then if you don't have that student coming in percentage, your bright idea might not work. Again, if you're too small for even 3 classes, obviously this variation solution is not going to work either. Want to talk supplementing FTE, pros and cons. The pro is that it resolves the current challenges. The con is funding. Not only finding the funding to supplement, but now you run up against an equal problem or an equity problem in terms of, well, this program we're gonna give extra funding to function, but other programs we're not. That's a little bit of a challenge. And not only do you have the money challenge, but do you have a lot of programs that operate that don't get special consideration when it comes to additional funding. Reconciling that. Consolidate small schools, pros and cons. A pro is by consolidating, you solve the one traditional problem in small classrooms. Another pro is the DLI option still becomes available. Students can still, in a consolidated, especially if there's another one nearby, they are able to go there. And I did try and account, all transparency, what other things might be a problem with consolidation, and that could be transportation. So let's say my boundary school no longer has DLI, but I'd like to go to DLI, and there's a close by school. Transportation piece could be an issue for me depending on my circumstance. A con to consolidating is enrollment decrease in the small school where DLI is discontinued. So let's take a small school that's has DLI but is still quite small, a 2-teacher per grade small school. Pick on Spring Lane from before. If we discontinued DLI at Spring Lane and 35% of the students went elsewhere, Spring Lane would have been a teeny school, not just a small school. So that's this in-boundary, out-of-boundary variable is a little bit of a challenge to figure out. Let me get to recommendations. Our recommendation is a consolidation model. And that's a challenge in some ways because historically, when we weren't declining enrollment, we had a lot of school decision-making around DLI. This change effectively is the district saying at a certain point, the program is going to be discontinued. So taking charge, if you will, as the district. We brainstormed on some criteria that would mean. And the quick, fast criteria is, well, let's name a number. If the school's this small, then that would constitute discontinuing. We didn't love that because it wasn't quite as nuanced and detailed. So we teased out some nuances to what would cause us to look at discontinuing a DLI program, and I bulleted those here. If a school only has one single traditional classroom in multiple grade levels, 4 consecutive years, not 4 as in the number, but 4 consecutive years, with a forecast of continued declining enrollment. So the idea is if these 4 areas were happening or in effect, we would look at discontinuing DLI at that location. I want to highlight to you when we put that up against schools, the 2 schools that would meet these 4 criteria currently are Monroe and Valley Crest. Past schools that would have met this criteria are Spring Lane and Mill Creek. So again, single traditional classroom in multiple grade levels, consecutive years with a forecast of continued declining enrollment. So if we say that that's the criteria and if that's happening, we're going to look to discontinue. What does discontinue look like? Our brainstorming there is 2 different halves or 2 different pathways that could be, and I'll speak to both of those. The first is discontinuing the DLI enrollment and allow current students to complete the pathway at the school. So that would mean not having DLI as first grade and allowing everyone else to cycle through. The second solution would be a consolidation solution, and this has 2 different nuanced parts. This consolidation could be a program consolidation, meaning the program's no longer at this location, but students may enroll at this location, or this could be a complete school consolidation solution. And the nuanced part of that, obviously, is overall school size. So again, I'll use Spring Lane as an example. If we were to have said, we're going to just consolidate Spring Lane's program somewhere else, most likely that small school would have gotten really small. And therefore, you're up against school consolidation or school closure. Let me tease it out a little more. In discontinuing DLI enrollment, you allow students to complete the pathway at the school, which feels really good for parents, so the students that are there have the opportunity to finish at that school. The downside of that, or the con of that, is you're gonna still run up against supplementing FTE at that location, at least until that cycle is through. So you're gonna run up against staffing and scheduling issues and having to supplement FTE to be able to have functioning classes. On a consolidation model, again, looking at neighbor schools that have the program, you have to take into account the school enrollment in the area, implications for school and surrounding schools. This is where we run up against this nexus of the PAC and what the PAC's looking at as well. This is why we had this study session to talk DLI, knowing what the PAC's looking at and having to wrestle with. This is the challenge and the case sample of why the two are somewhat connected. Specifically around the PAC discussion that's happening in 3500 South Corridor study. Monroe and Valley Crest, I believe, are in that study area. And they fit the challenge or the qualifications, if you will, or the criteria that we're naming in terms of one traditional in multiple grade levels for multiple years and a forecast of declining enrollment. It's important to note, too, in all transparency, we do have some other schools who meet some of those criteria, but not all 4 of those criteria. Questions?
I am curious, in this presentation, we're not talking about looking at DLI and the Cypress network. And that was one of my questions before. When or where is that considered in this discussion? Like, when will we get to that point, if ever?
Yeah, I would look to superintendent or leadership when to add that piece. I know that that's been brought up, and part of our wrestling with is school decision on adding or not. I will say, Sherry had mentioned, and maybe I'll have you speak to this to get it right, that the state board has put a hold on adding. You speak to that, Sherry.
So currently, we receive our funding for dual immersion programs from the state. And the state at this point is not allowing any dual immersion programs to be added under the state funding model unless they're two-way Spanish programs. So if we were to add a dual immersion program, it would have to be a two-way. And
Can you explain two-way?
so two-way is when students are learning the language two ways. So you're looking to serve a predominantly Spanish-speaking population where you have high numbers of, and that's this 3500 South dual immersion schools. A lot of the principals, when they started that was in response to that. It's providing Spanish-speaking students the opportunity to be in dual immersion, primarily as their service model for multi-language learner instruction, because they're learning the content in their native language. So the premise is that they academically do not fall behind because they're learning, math, science, social studies, all in the language, which is their native language. But they're also receiving their English instruction in a dual immersion model, which uses all of the strategies for acquiring English that you would learn use to acquire another language. So does that make sense?
That still doesn't make sense to me in terms of anybody that could opt into a dual language immersion program that's a native speaker. So what's the distinction? So a
you're
native
looking
Chinese
at-
speaker could do the same thing and learn those English principles?
It's just the numbers. So in a two-way program, you're looking to have 30% of the students, a minimum of 30%, no more than 70% as native speakers of the target language. So for Spanish or for French or Chinese, it would be really hard for us to get that level of student participation.
I have a question. Are you done, Kim? Sorry.
I have a couple of follow-ups, if that's okay,
Could
sorry.
I follow up with some additional information on that real quick to your question? Just so you're aware, as we've been discussing as part of the previous boundary study, the administration recognizes that we were lacking some additional opportunities within that Cypress network. And we actually initiated a study to determine if and what the community is interested in. And we actually met today to look at some of the results of that study. Our follow-up step is to actually go out to the Magna Elementary community because we feel like that might be an ideal location to place any modified programming at. We do want to be competitive with some of the other schools and other educational opportunities within that community. So JD Talbot will be doing a focus group with that particular community to further help us inform what the community desires. I will indicate on the initial survey, the DLI was not the top choice. It was one of the options. It was one of the top 3 choices, but STEAM and an arts integrated program were the top 2 options. So we've actually not had a chance, because we wanted to do some follow-up within the community itself, some additional focus groups to share that information with the administrative team. But your question is timely, so I thought I'd share that.
I appreciate that, thank you. And it's interesting information to have on this topic. I guess my follow-up is, so the two-way situation would allow us to start a new program. I would imagine we have some of those scenarios existing in some of the Cypress Network schools. But also, if we were considering consolidating programs or shutting down programs, there's no moving a program from one school to another. That would just be considered a new program. There's no transfer option.
We could move programs, similar to what we did with the Chinese program. The state and at Mill Creek, the state allowed us to move those programs to other locations and continued our funding.
So in theory, we would have some options if the community actually decides they want that in Cypress Network.
Yeah, and I think it's important to point out as well, too, that this recommendation is a shift in what our approach has been. Our approach has been a school-level decision, and we're recommending that we need to have some criteria due to this school size challenges in one traditional classroom. So again, in all transparency, that school decision shift to more of a district-level decision around, you've got to at least be able to meet these 4 criteria before. And as we look to adding or anything in the future, we would probably hold true to this. Obviously, if it was a really small school who wanted to take that on, we would want to make sure that they wouldn't be, again, disqualified because they were too small.
I know you have a question. Can I follow up on that? So I'm trying to understand what that looks like from a practical standpoint. Does that mean that the district is taking control over the DLI programs that are run within the district? Or is it still a school level program? Or where does that, your comments sounded a little vague to me in that regard, so I wonder if you can clarify them, please.
Yeah, what we're looking at is for the board's approval for us to apply this criteria to any DLI school in Granite School District. The 2 that would immediately be affected would be Monroe and Valley Crest, being too small. And therefore, we would look to discontinue and allow through or consolidate. And I think consolidation, when it comes to those 2, coincides with the 3500 South corridor. That's going to dictate which of those 2 routes we go with those 2 schools, paired with looking at what percentage of students are in and out. Let's say we went to Valley Crest and we said, hey, we're going to discontinue DLI at Valley Crest because it only has one traditional in multiple grade levels. It's been multiple years and they're a declining enrollment. Well, we couldn't really just discontinue there. It wouldn't work because they're small enough that the loss of DLI would make them too small. So really the only option there becomes looking at moving that program or consolidating that program or consolidating school. Again, both of those schools being in that corridor study.
So I hear where you're coming from, but I'm going to pin you down here. Because these are the questions that our DLI communities are going to ask.
Right.
So is the district taking control over all of the programs or not?
That is my recommendation to the board and the superintendent as well.
And I should have prefaced, under your recommendation, is
Yeah.
that the recommendation that you're
I don't get to
providing?
say.
I get it, and I should have clarified, and I'm just anticipating the questions, right, from
Right.
patrons saying, so, because it's been this school-based model for so long, well,
Yep.
since inception.
Yep.
And that's, I just want to be clear on what the proposed change actually is, that this would now be district control. Obviously, we would hope to get input from parents at every step along the way, but ultimately, you're saying the proposal is for the district to take complete control.
In terms of whether it continues or not, yes.
Is there some other factor or component that the district would not have control over?
No. I just think of, sometimes we get into staffing ratios or hiring or all those things, and those haven't been something that's been solely school. Those have always been cooperative.
Understood, thank you.
The superintendent, I saw you were.
Superintendent has a comment.
Well, yeah, I think defining control is important, and I think it's laid out here. District, it is primarily and first would continue to be foremost a school program per se, but if the school program doesn't meet certain criteria, the district takes control of the program to shore it up to make it the DLI program that the school and that community needs. Because anything below those, the proposal is anything, and the reality is anything less than those four, you begin to have compromises to the education of the school. So district control really is these parameters. The district, in terms of support of a school program, it exists, and we have, Sherry does a great job. She's our district DLI specialist that's providing that district level support. So they're not necessarily on an island of themselves, but in terms of figuring out some things, that right there becomes the definition of district control. Just to be clear and be able to articulate the talking points that we would need in going to talk to the community, but that you would also need when you had constituents come to you and say, well, why? We've been doing this already. Why do we need to consolidate? And so just being able to provide that definition of what control means and the why will be helpful.
Chris?
So I'm looking at your recommendations for, here's the criteria, the single classroom, consecutive years. Are you going to put for 3 consecutive years or 2, or are you going to put some, just because I'm wondering, I think if a community is wanting to know, is our school in, because there's probably other schools that are on that, maybe close to that criteria, so for them to be a little more either comfortable with their school or to know we've got to make sure this program stays, what do we need to do?
Yeah, we didn't put a number to that. I guess you could read this literally. What's consecutive? Well, 2. But we didn't put a number to that. Feeling like bullet 3 and 4 really work together here. So if it's been a couple of years and you're forecasted to continue to decline, we know a third's coming. We know a fourth's coming. So we didn't feel like putting a number to it, but I think anyone could translate as consecutive years at a minimum of more than 1.
Okay, and just to follow up, so what would that look like for those schools that are in this kind of almost meeting this criteria? Is it go in and talk to them and so they're prepared, or is this, next year, guess what, your programs?
No, yeah, what you had first said. So once we feel comfortable with this recommendation and solution, alerting all of our principals to, hey, this is what we're looking at, and start communicating and sharing that, not only with principals, but with teachers and communities as well.
I would expect this would give us the latitude to start having those conversations as part of the PAC study process, with all the community engagement that's entailed with that.
Karen?
Couple of things. I think it's important for us to keep in mind, and these are all good questions, but at the end of the day, this current DLI model, especially along this corridor, really isn't functioning. Is that fair to say? That there are a lot of problems
I think so,
coming
yes.
up? A lot of inequities. I've heard, I was talking to a teacher just over the weekend who, it seems like in their school, it's the haves and the have-nots, right? So I don't personally feel comfortable just continuing on because it's just, if it's not working, we have to realize that's why we're having the conversation, right? Is how can we get these to function better than they're currently functioning? So I think that's important. My question is, have you gone as far as those, so let's say Valley Crest and Monroe in the consolidation recommendation, have you gone so far as to saying where that would go? I mean, is there like a direction of where you're taking those kids, or is it just weaning them out until it's done and it's done?
I think with Monroe and Valley Crest, because they fall in that corridor study, we need to see that piece
Play
fall
through.
into place
Okay.
and then decide what direction we're going to go. But I think
Because
the
remind me,
PAC
what are the other two? We have 4 Spanish dual immersion. Monroe and Valley Crest are 2. Who are the other 2 that are right there?
Hillsdale,
Hillsdale and Stansbury. Okay.
Hillsdale, Stansbury, Granger. Stansbury and Granger, yeah. It's Monroe and Valley Crest that when we apply these 4 criteria that qualify, if you will.
Kim, you had some additional questions?
Can we revisit the topic of the legislature potentially removing the funding for DLI altogether? When will we know more on that?
I'll refer to Sherry for that.
Which Todd and Superintendent may need to chime in. Do you want to take it? Or go ahead. You guys go ahead.
Short answer, we don't know. At this point, the Public Ed Appropriations Committee recommended that it be sustained. So in other words, it would last for another year, so the 24-25 school year. During the interim, they would have a deeper study into the DLI program. There's also a second program that they would do this with as well. But that's, as far as we know right now, we won't know for certain until Senate Bill 2 is drafted as to whether they do continue with the funding into the next school year.
Because I just worry that we go down this path of making recommendations, and then perhaps those recommendations affect other recommendations, and we make decisions around DLI, and then we lose it. Would those decisions have been different if we hadn't taken that path, right? And so is it prudent to maybe wait on any decisions until we know that? I mean, it feels like you've got to weigh 2 sides, because we have schools where maybe education is suffering in the meantime, right? So we need to take action, but then if
So
our,
may I interject with a question to that point? How much, if any, did the state's, for lack of a better word, threat this year to defund DLI factor into your recommendation that we've heard tonight?
We had very little conversations about that. Our conversation was mostly this small school challenge and one traditional classroom challenge. We didn't look closely at what does that mean if this funding is reduced. And it would have been better to look more closely at that in this, but I honestly feel like our true challenge is this small school challenge.
I would point out to Kim's question direct, the PAC study process aligns quite well with what we'll know about funding, either through an interim portion and a heavier study this summer through into the fall, that we could either delay a decision or make a recommendation based on what we do know at that point in time later on this fall.
May I ask another follow-up question to that point? Sorry. How much funding do we receive from the state, if we know, as we sit here, or approximately? Because when we talk about this small school problem, we're talking about FTE problems. So, the FTE is what it is. So what are we receiving in terms of extra funds from the state in the first place?
So the money we receive in Granite, is kind of probably deceiving because we have 3 state-supported dual immersion specialists on staff that we are receiving their salary and benefits in our dual immersion allocations. We have 1 French and 2 Chinese state specialists. So I don't see it, and maybe I'm wrong, that we would do away with dual immersion. What it is state funding will go away for dual immersion. So what you're looking at is about $5,000 per elementary school that's a dual immersion school. That's the state funding. We're very fortunate in Granite that we have district-supported specialist and director support in my position, and we have 2 Spanish specialists that are not paid by state funds. They're paid by Granite because we started dual immersion prior to the state model. So we already had some of those components of dual immersion in place outside of the state funding, and were able to get state funding once it was the state dual immersion program was implemented. So I would see it would continue with just district support with the dual immersion money going in the WPU.
So that was actually my question as well, is what funding are we receiving? Then further on that, if our elementaries are receiving $5,000, is that because that is what they are allocated per law? Or is that because that's what we've decided to do in our own budgetary decision making? And then also, can you give me some ideas of what that $5,000 is spent on in a school? Does that mean that has to be spent for DLI, or does that become discretionary?
Yes, it's a designated line item for dual immersion. So the $5,000 covers the instructional materials because we follow the state model. And every year they give us a buy guide, say these are the materials that you should purchase for this in order to follow the state model. So yes, and then substitute days for sending teachers to state training. So those are the primarily instruction materials and substitutes for professional learning days.
Okay, and along this line of the funding, do we know, maybe Superintendent or Todd, maybe you guys might be the right people to ask, but I get this idea that other districts are putting more money into their DLI programs. What can you tell me about how they're doing it? Because when I talk to other school board members this session about losing the DLI funding, like, I've been like, well, it's too bad, but like, we'll carry on. And they've been like, oh my gosh, like, what are we going to do? And I'm like, really? And then I find out that they're saying, well, yeah, we've put a lot of funding into our DLI programs. And I know here that we have felt differently because we want to make sure that that funding is equitably spread. So can you just speak to it?
Sure, I'll speak from my perspective in talking with other superintendents, and Todd can give another, working with VAs and other board members. Some districts have by greater percentage more DLI programs than we do. And so for them to reduce the funding, they have a heavier burden because of just the absolute number of students served in their DLI programs. And so you're seeing across some districts, and again, it's anecdotal at this point, I've not quantified, but they're already reducing or consolidating their DLI programs.
That the people who are stressed, that now makes sense. That's exactly what it is.
Yeah.
But can you also speak to are they subsidizing somehow so that those DLI programs remain strong, or what?
To the extent that their budgets allow. The DLI funding that we get doesn't necessarily cover the whole DLI financial burden, and Todd can speak to that. So there is some subsidizing, if you will, anyway, of DLI. Maybe not more so because we have some offsetting costs than other programs we run, but but it does take a financial lift, whether with state funding or just local effort.
But like, when you say subsidizing, are you saying, yeah, we'll subsidize with the curriculum and the PD, or are you saying there's possibility of subsidizing FTE?
Even FTE.
FTE.
Now, usually what
Okay.
you see when they're doing that for a long period or a longer period of time, they're subsidizing, but it's not sustainable. And so that's where they may use it to subsidize it for a moment until they can get to a point of consolidation or elimination, right? And so even in subsidizing it, I've not seen a model where in keeping with, the best practice of how to do it, where it's actually been sustained, actually becomes phased out. And usually what you see in that, and having lived this too in Ogden, when you consolidate, it's a grandfathering through the grades in one respect, or taking two programs and making one. And so between each of those, that gets you to a more sustainable model that's in keeping with what a DLI program should look like.
I don't have any greater wisdom on that, other than I think the subsidy is probably the other way around. We have a DLI program and the state's subsidizing us as opposed to the other way. The districts will be carrying more of the cost, and the state makes money available, or even is now.
I know, wasn't it Tooele District that just dropped DLI because of the funding problems? Or
They
German,
dropped two.
Russian,
They dropped Russian and Portuguese.
I think it might be Chinese or Portuguese.
Chinese, Russian, German. Anyway, so I'm wondering if some of that decision from their board ties into this subsidized, issue where you're taking funds from. I mean, we have limited funds, right? So you got to kind of, what's the best use of those precious dollars that we do have? So can you, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but do you have any knowledge of why they chose to do what they did? I know you.
Twilla?
Yeah. I'm just wondering that was a pretty bold thing for them to come out and cut 3 of their languages. So I'm wondering if they're facing kind of some similar things here. So I'm wondering, okay, all right, let's, Julie, to your point, some districts are like, yeah, we got to keep our DLI, but Tooele's also, a pretty relatively close district who's decided to cut programs.
Yeah.
But you could also say they were more aggressive initially if they were having programs such as Russian and German and Portuguese.
Yeah,
So,
that's
that
a
can
fair
go both
point.
ways is all I'm saying. I didn't mean to cut you off.
But Chinese
Superintendent.
is one of them, and we also have Chinese, so.
Yeah, so that's a big part of it. They launched in early. They put DLI essentially in every school across their district. And because they were aggressive in that space, also, it's even an FTE issue. How do we find qualified teachers in each of those languages? Yes. And so there's multiple moving parts in terms of the challenge, but yeah.
Speaking to one of the board members there, she said that was the primary reason, is it was a challenge to get teachers and to keep that, and it was just they felt like they were spread too thin. And they said, let's focus in on the languages that are much more popular.
I just bring it up to point out mainly that we're not the only district that's struggling to see what direction we want to take with DLI. I'm sure those conversations are ongoing, across the board, so.
At USBA, when it's lunchtime, DLI comes up every time. Like, that's what people want to talk about. So can I ask some questions?
Go for it.
One of the things that has been readily apparent to me is that with DLI, we're really competing against other districts for students. And for example, with the Chinese program that we moved to Oakwood, its major competitor is in the Canyons district. And so I wonder how we're tackling that, because as we look at this idea of discontinuing a DLI program, it means losing kids from our district if we discontinue a program. If we can find another home for them, awesome, but if not, we lose kids. So I wonder, how are we thinking about that in this time of declining enrollment? Does that weigh into this decision, or do we say that's one of the casualties?
I think it's a little bit nuanced, meaning, I like your Oakwood example, and I think that's a fairly good example because it's bordering, if you will, another school district. So typically when we see a loss of a student, it's not for a long distance travel, it's somewhere that's bordering that the parent feels like is a better solution or fit. Not always, but for the most part. We're not pulling a lot of out of boundaries students in our DLI centrally. Again, I'll pick on the 3500 corridor. We're not seeing a lot of students from, what would it be, Jordan, coming over to those Spanish DLI because it's just not bordering. Oakwood, I think there's some of that too, and we could disaggregate and look at the numbers as to how many. When I give you that 65-35 in terms of DLI averaging what they're bringing in, I haven't disaggregated it by in-district and out-of-district, but my sense is out-of-district's a lower percentage than you would think. It's mostly in-district. But that is a factor here as we're declining enrollment as a district overall and trying to be strategic around the options and specialized courses that we offer.
Rick, can I just, the flip side of that is I know these schools along the 3500 corridor, what's happening is they're actually, that the non-DLI students are choosing to leave the school because it's not functioning. So it can go both ways, right? You consolidate a program, you might lose a DLI kid, but you might also retain 5-10 kids per school, which makes a big difference because specifically to the 3500 South Corridor, these ones that have come up, West Valley has an unprecedented amount of charter schools. And so those are also in our competition. And while we need to remain competitive and have offerings like DLI, we just need to keep it tucked in our head. There's an opposite side to that argument that by dropping DLI, we actually may attract some of the families who are frustrated that their non-DLI kids are not having a good educational experience under the current model. So I think that's just important to bring up that that argument has two sides.
That's an excellent point. That's the one traditional class problem. A parent who only has that one traditional class piece might opt to go elsewhere to a charter, et cetera. So that's an excellent flip to that, or point to that, is it could act in reverse when you get that small.
I have a few more questions, but Connie, go ahead, because, okay. So back to Clark's point about, is this a school level program or a district level program? I think what I heard you say is, what you're recommending here is a way for the district to control whether a DLI program continues or not. What I don't want to do is have a situation where we're like, good luck school communities, and then we're like, oh, you didn't meet all these criteria, so you're out. You know, like, I would like to see us, if we're going to have a way that we're going to discontinue a DLI program, I would like us to have a program by which we are going to make sure that we are maintaining healthy DLI schools and some sort of pathway that we are going to take in order to let schools know that they are going to be supported. And I think we're already doing things that are supportive. I think that schools are not aware that they are receiving those supports. And I think it's important for them to know they are being supported. But I also think there are ways in which we could support them more, but we don't know that we need to support them in these ways. And as we've had these changes, I mean, Clark and I have been really in the middle of these DLI changes that we've been seeing happening at Penn and Oakwood. And those parents will give some great feedback. They will tell you this is what we need, and it's not stuff that's gonna cost more money necessarily, it's expertise. I mean, they feel like, I'm putting words in their mouth, the things I'm hearing make me under the impression that they feel that they're floundering trying to make this work, and when they're really not alone, you know? So I would like us to see, as part of this recommendation, a recommendation of how we as a district are going to support these schools so that they don't get to this point. Because we don't want any of them to close. We don't want, I mean, we have some that we are likely going to say that's their best option, or, I mean, I don't know likely, but we're gonna study. But we would rather prevent it, right? So what can we do to get there?
Per that, before you, that was one of my comments, is that I feel like the schools are left on their own to advertise, to get the word out, and when we have dropping enrollment overall in the district anyway, if we're gonna do this, I wanna see us send out through the communications department, hey, do you know that we have DLI programs here? These are the options. I don't know that I see that much. Maybe you guys do send it out, but I would certainly want this to, I do want these programs to succeed, and the best way for them to succeed is by us helping them out with that. Is that kind of what you're?
I think that is what I'm saying, but I also, I mean, it really is to what Clark said, who's in charge here? Is the district in charge, or is the school in charge? And I think that it's really important to clarify. I think if I'm a parent and I know nothing about DLI, and I'm coming into a community council, or I'm a principal and I've never worked at a DLI school before, which happens, it would be really helpful for me to understand what my checklist of responsibilities was, because we know that this can be a very complex beast, having a DLI school.
Dr. Nye?
I think there's two parts, but in terms of the communication, Ben, if you wouldn't speak to a little bit about some of our current efforts, and then we can certainly take under advisement some future efforts, but then I would like to go back to this notion of centralized versus decentralized.
Thank you for the opportunity. This is a good question, and I can assure you that those parents have indicated what we need to be doing in their behalf. And,
I do know that.
and we've tried to listen and reflect that. I will tell you, the last 2 years, we've actually started, there's been a dilemma that the district has faced by virtue of the fact that this has been treated as a school level program that we're not going to advertise, right? And we don't want to be drawing, competing our schools against each other, which is what we end up doing. But recognizing that some of these programs were suffering, we did start doing emails out to pre-K and kindergarten and first grade families on it. And we did that again this last spring as part of the open enrollment process with information on all of our DLI programs and how to access those and what those programs are about with the appropriate materials and support. That being said, my marketing budget is limited to your budget because I'm really stealing board funds anytime I want to do any sort of formal marketing. We don't have sufficient funding for some of these initiatives above and beyond to draw new students into the district itself. So we are basically trying to pull kids from internally using the only method we have, which is essentially email. One of the things that I would like to do, and that we did last spring as the open enrollment period winded down, to be very strategic about which programs need to be shored up. Particularly, it's not just about DLI, it's also shoring up English only, right? And working with Sherry and her folks to identify where that can be. But then again, I just want you to know I'm stealing from your board budget to make those marketing materials, to pay for that postage and to make those things happen. And so there is this question that has been lingering, and this recommendation and the board's input on this is critical, because you are essentially going to tell us whether it's okay to provide that material support, even though there's a little bit of an inequity there based on funding and the resources and time that we're allocating to that. So I'm happy to answer any specific questions.
What do you mean inequity?
we're spending money to market certain schools
Oh, okay.
over other programs, and primarily, the schools that will lose out are schools within our district
Yeah.
on those populations.
I've really appreciated the way that you have been aware that you are marketing both the DLI and the traditional program, and that your efforts to make sure that both of those are, when you market, are attracting people. And also, I really do think that it's been important. The collaboration that you've made with community councils has been really important, because I do think the communities know what information is going to be interesting to their community. So I appreciate the times when you've really made that effort to listen to those communities, because I think it's always more effective. And I just wanted to send that out there.
And I'll be brief. And so to that point, because, and it was alluded to, a lot of our surrounding district neighbors have DLI programs. We're not drawing them to ours because they have their own. And so we can continue to market, but really the students we're pulling from are from other schools that are our own schools. And we could pull some. It would be interesting, I think, to know if we are losing any students to charter DLI programs, but I don't know that we are. I'd have to look at any kind of data that we could get our hands on to determine that. So I don't know that we're necessarily pulling from charters at this point either, without taking a look at some data. In fact, I'm not sure which charters have DLI programs. There's some
Perhaps some Spanish
language-based.
two-way
Yeah.
type looks.
Yep, language-based programs perhaps, but not the DLI program as constituted by the state. The only other thing that I would suggest, and it's nuanced here, I think should be stated again, is we've gone back and forth, I think, in our district between what is a centralized model and a decentralized model. Centralized is a district type program, decentralized is school-based. If I were to poll, if you're more familiar with the IT world, it's the difference between federated, not to be confused with the federal government, versus centralized, right? And so what does it look like? What we're suggesting in this, and what the board is wrestling with right now, is to say, if we have a school that we have stewardship over who might be struggling in their DLI program, are we going to let them continue to struggle? Because it's a school program, we've taken a hands-off approach, and they've had to struggle through that, and we have concerns with that. What we're suggesting is, if it's more centralized, and that's the word I'd rather use than control, because it really is a partnership, if you will, with the school, maybe in ways that hasn't been realized before. That's the centralized model, to be able to say, how are we going to consider the needs of our students in our communities and the DLI services that we're providing to make sure that they are high quality in the event that they become compromised, and making sure that we're responsive to that need.
I wanted to point out as well, and I'll borrow from the superintendent's words, the struggle can be a perspective, and I'll give you three different groups of perspective. I think you have the teacher's admin perspective, who are living the day-to-day challenges with staffing. You have the DLI parent perspective, who's third graders in DLI, and it's great. And then you have the traditional class parent perspective. And depending on that perspective, you're gonna hear a different voice. And sometimes one of those voices is louder than the others and gets heard more than others. And so, part of what we're trying to do is step back, because we hear all three of those voices, and say, okay, what's reasonable here in terms of that perspective and functioning and meeting the needs of staff and scheduling, meeting the needs of DLI parent, meeting the needs of traditional parent as well.
Yeah, because ultimately we do need all three of them. I mean, if we're hearing louder from one group, well, that group's suffering, and we got to get in there and help, right? I love this. The concept of the partnership has been discussed, and I think that we might be onto something there. The idea of a partnership in the school. Yeah, I'm very interested in the idea of creating a structure that will help us make sure that our DLI schools are healthy. I think that's a really important thing. I also wonder if we are looking at temporary solutions that could help our schools, our DLI schools, achieve long-term good health. Because we've discussed that with the schools that we've consolidated or moved DLI programs, and we're on the very cusp of that. So will you comment on that?
My thoughts, maybe not directly related, is the culprit in all of this. Our biggest challenge is declining enrollment, and that's what's hitting us with the DLI. There was a time when we were expanding DLI under this idea of it will recruit. Right, Mill Creek, for example. Let's pick up Spanish DLI. We're declining enrollment. Let's Hail Mary. I mean, I'm being a little extreme there, but let's pick up DLI in this attempt to recruit. And we learned that it didn't work. It didn't work. And so yeah, we can do better about marketing and offering specialization and grappling with market share around students, and should. But our overall culprit is just declining enrollment in general, and recognizing that and being perhaps smart in doing a quality job with what we have.
I think part of that is building the structure, as you've indicated, that's data-driven. I think that each of these programs are unique and dynamic in the communities that they serve, and we saw that there was a huge difference between what was happening in Spring Lane and what was happening at Mill Creek. Enrollment was part of that, but there was a lot more open enrollment at Mill Creek, whereas I feel anecdotally on these programs we're discussing along 3500 South Corridor, it appears that many of the participants are not special permitting to come to participate in that program. They're simply participating in the program because it's available at their school. And if it was at another location, they probably wouldn't leave their location to go to that program. So we do need to be data-driven, and we need to assess and we need to study as part of this PAC process why people are making the decisions they're making in the respective locations that they're making it in.
I think what I meant to ask was, do we, I guess we haven't put together what our plan is to make sure that our DLI program schools are healthy schools. And I think my question is, are temporary solutions that lead to long-term health a part of that plan? Because we have had discussions about temporary FTE, extra FTE funding in order to, stabilize a population or things like this, which I think are, temporarily great solutions if they lead to long-term health, right? But I also feel like we only have so much of that to go around. So I think that that's an important conversation for us to have, because otherwise we're willing to say yes over here, but then someone else comes in, oh yeah, you need it too, and oh, you need it too, but then pretty soon we're in big trouble. And so I think it's important for us to have some boundaries around that somehow, because it does seem like it could be a great temporary solution for long-term, Yeah,
to carry you. And this is where I go back to this fourth bullet, and then even this needs to be teased out. A forecast of continued declining enrollment. Well, how do we tease out what's causing the declining enrollment? Is it gentrification? Is it loss to other entities? So it can be case to case a little bit. I mean, in general, we know our declining enrollment on the east side is, if we were to pick a culprit for that, is gentrification and home prices. West side, it kind of can depend. That can depend on the area. It can depend on what other options there are. So we have to tease it out place to place, one school at a time.
I would add to the letters of assurance that we've given respective communities as part of consolidations of the programs. We've already done that. I can't see us going into some of these communities, as Rick has indicated, trying to shore up with FTE a program that's hitting on all these criteria, right? But as we make a recommendation as part of that PAC process, assuming this is a good way to go and the board's comfortable with it, that we could provide some assurances once we consolidate something. and have a plan moving forward to make sure that program can stay healthy or get to a healthier place. That being said, with respect to the Magna issue, I would love to have a DLI program in that community. It would be nice to be able to provide our residents, our patrons in that community that option a little bit closer to home, but I wouldn't dare put a program at a place where we do not have the student basis to do so, even if it was the number one option as part of our survey, because I wouldn't want to make a recommendation. I don't think anybody in this room wants to aim for failure down the road, knowing that we may not draw the students we need necessarily long-term to make that happen. So that declining enrollment piece is a huge part of that, as Rick's indicated.
So can I just kind of piggyback on that, Julie? Kind of pertaining to the east side problem issue, I don't want to call them a problem, issue. There's obviously not options to consolidate them. So would we entertain if those 4 criteria are met, but maybe that you have the option to do, what was the other one?
A standalone program of some sort?
No, the one teacher solution. Would you
Yeah, the
offer to them
variations.
first? Because, I mean, I don't know that the declining enrollment is quite, I think they're declined. It feels like the east side is kind of where they're at. And they're not going to continue, but do they still have a single traditional classroom? Would it be something that we could then say, okay, because it's a case-by-case basis, maybe we do offer the one teacher solution because we don't have the consolidation, we don't have the option of moving it to a different school that has a higher enrollment? Or is that something that, like, within this recommendation, is that something you would put in there or no?
Well, we haven't in this one, but just expanding on what you're highlighting is we only have one French and Chinese on the east side and one on the west side, and it could be particularly painful to go down to one only on one side of the valley. I think that's kind of what you're pointing out, is what if that was to happen, whether it's Diamond Ridge or whether it's Morningside or wherever, dropping to just one and a long travel within our district. We didn't consider what could a variation of that look like, but I think within the structure that we've provided, there's possibilities. Some of that's going to go back to the tough question around supplementing or not, FTE, and that certainly could be an option. Again, we don't like that option compared to some of the others, but you're highlighting where it could be particularly painful in these one location east and west instances.
I guess the reason why I bring that up is because I just think if we are going to lose students because we get rid of a DLI program, I can see that it would be particularly painful in Julie and Clark's area mostly. That's where we're going to lose them. We're going to lose them to, whichever DLI program is close by, right? And so I would rather see us keep that as an option when, just depending on if that school, if it does qualify for there, but they've, stabilized an enrollment of some sort, that maybe we talk about that. Anyway, just my thoughts. I don't know what you guys think.
And,
Oh, go ahead.
no, I keep talking. You say
Well,
something.
my question to that, though, is if it continues to be a small school, we're in that same problem we had before with Spring Lane and some of those other. So my worry is we try these variations and then they still don't shore up a population. Do you just say, oh, we're going to continue with the one teacher solution, and then they never meet the criteria to end the program, So I'm wondering, just like, that's kind of where my thoughts went on that.
Yeah, those variations can carry you. And like I talked about earlier, you could cap and just run one DLI and two traditional as a solution. There's some variation solutions that could be options as well, and that might carry you through. I think again that your ultimate culprit's going to be declining enrollment overall. You could maybe hold off the inevitable with some of those solutions, or not, depending on your overall enrollment.
So I have a question about the two schools that are, the Monroe and Valley Crest, are they in a position where they do have just one teacher per grade teaching both, you know, so are they in that position right now?
Yep.
Because of the loss of, you know,
Yep, both of those meet these 4 criteria, but what you're asking, Connie, is are they also leveraging variation solutions to try? Yeah, so they're small enough where they only have one traditional classroom, but they're also having to use variation solutions just to be able to carry the DLI that they have. That's how small they are. And that was true of Spring Lane and Mill Creek as well.
I still have 3 questions.
Okay, I have a listing.
So this makes it so that it is a district decision to close a DLI school. Is there still room for a community to make the decision that they want to close the close a DLI school, close a DLI program? Could a community also decide they want to close a DLI program?
I would think so, but I would hope that they would be able to make this same argument that we're making in these criteria as well, that they're experiencing these 4 things. Historically, we haven't seen that, even though they're experiencing it. But I think that, again, goes back to my question of what voice are we hearing? Are we hearing DLI parent voice? Are we hearing staff and administration voice? Are we hearing traditional parent voice? I think those 3 voices can have very different perspectives depending on their experience. And we need to weigh all 3 of those. And this attempt is trying to be reasonable around all 3 perspectives and what's best for the whole.
I'm
can I
especially
just-
thinking of Oakwood.
Well, I was going to speak to that. I think we've given them some assurances as part of the previous boundary decision made by this board that they're going to be able to have a say in their program down the road, and I think
So we'll honor that regardless of what we do here.
I believe we need to do
I
that.
think that's what I wanted, that assurance.
Can I just piggyback on that? And I think the whole listen to the voice is important. We're elected board members. We need to obviously always have ears open. I do think it's important to understand where people are coming from because sometimes the loudest voices actually represent the minority. It just happens to be that they're the loudest. And so as we're, you know, with that community feedback, I would just want to ensure that we're hearing not from just one particular group, but from all the groups, just so we can make a balanced decision. Because I know in my experience as a board member, sometimes the loudest group isn't necessarily representing the whole group.
In my discussions with people, this question came up. You know, I kind of said the same thing that Karen said, that one of the frustrations with the DLI program is often it turns into the haves and have-nots. And somebody said to me, that doesn't need to be that way. There are schools out there that are DLI schools who are doing such a great job of making sure that they meet the interests of kids, that it is not haves and have-nots, it's interested and uninterested. And I didn't know if I believed them that was true, but I wanted to know what anybody else knows about that. Because I love that idea. Ideally, let's get there, you know, but I'd love to know if we've seen it that way.
Yeah, I'll start, and Sherry might have some thoughts there as well. This is a tough one to tease out. If we let's point to the structure that creates haves and have-nots, and I'm going to point to one traditional classroom creates the haves and have-nots structure. And, you know, just depending on the have-nots depends on several different things. It depends on move-ins. It depends on the degree to which parents have the privilege to be involved heavily. It depends on the teacher. It depends on several factors. I think for the most part, by only having that one traditional classroom, you're having to have a lot of other stars align to avoid that have and have not scenario.
Yeah, I think Rick was just really accurate. I think where you see healthy dual immersion programs are when you've got balance between equal number of traditional equal number of dual immersion. And there are exceptions to that, but primarily it's ensuring that both sides of it have what they need to be successful. And I think where you probably hear that is when they know that more FTEs going to dual immersion because they have to try to make it work. So
what I feel is a bold follow-up question to that, is there a reason for us to say, one of the structures that we are going to put in place in our DLI programs is that we are going to allow 2 DLI per grade? And first graders, you only get 2 teachers, and we do not accept more than that because we need room for 2 traditional classes. I mean, is this one of the structures that needs to be put in place? Because to me, this need to say, oh, I've got all these people who are coming in who want DLI, so I'm going to accommodate them with more, is what creates this inequity.
I don't think we have any, other than Penn, I think that's the only one that has more than 2 per grade.
Okay, so yeah, Penn is obviously the one on my
Vista
mind.
has 3 first grades, but that was an intentional decision on the principal's part because she had the FTE and she didn't want to have the high class sizes in the lower grades. So
Where was that?
Vista. She intentionally had 3, and she got input from me, from her SLID. She chose to have 3 smaller first grades with the idea that they will collapse into the 2
And
later on.
1 or 2 traditional first grade?
I think there's one. But that's been the norm at Vista, but they bring so many out-of-boundary students to Vista because it's the only Spanish dual immersion right in that area.
Well, you know what, since, as Nicole points out, it's kind of an exception to the rule, I think it's okay to not talk about it, and we can talk about it uniquely to Penn when we need to talk about Penn. And it speaks to this deal that, like, these are such unique situations. It's very hard to generalize what's going to be best. And back to the district versus local control and maybe the need of the partnership, because these are such unique situations. And I had one more thing to say, and this is...
Wait, I do want to push back a little bit on what you said, Rick, sorry. But you said that this happens, we see that inequity happening when we have one English classroom. I think that, a traditional classroom, I should say, I think it happens when you have 2. Because you see the parents who, and I've seen that, I'm saying that as a DLI parent, because the non-DLI classes, the traditional classrooms, are the ones that struggle to get parents to come in and help. They struggle to have, I have a friend who teaches in a traditional classroom, and she has 24 kids, 4 of them are green, and the rest are red.
You're saying even if they have 2 classes?
Even if they have 2 classes, and they have 2 classes. So I feel like that still that inequity exists, even if they do have the 2 classes. Hopefully, it's true that she's second grade, so hopefully the second grade classes that are the DLI are larger, and so she does have that smaller class, but still, that's a struggle, and that's, I think you'd hear from DLI, non-DLI teachers, the traditional teachers, that's a difficult thing to deal with. And I think, to me, that's what my concern is that even if we have these 4 classes, we're still seeing inequalities in what we're providing or what we're able to, kind of the classroom model, what's happening there. And I think that, to me, when you say additional supports, that's where the support needs to go. We've got to make sure that those 20 kids that are in the red, they need to have, that's to me is where I feel like we see so much inequality, so.
I certainly think that's true as well. I guess I would just point out that it's just worse when there's just one traditional class. And I did think of an example of sometimes where it works. So sometimes you might have one traditional class, and it seems to be working okay because there's 14 kids in that traditional class because the numbers worked out that way. And so the teacher might have students who, for various reasons, are struggling in that traditional side, but will pick the class size poison, if you will, meaning I'll take the small class size and work through it, and therefore it doesn't come up. So an example of how this can be nuanced, and certainly having more than one traditional doesn't solve all challenges by any means. I think it's just trying to hone in on some points that feel like they're really going to get the mass, or get to the root of the problem the best. We didn't dare go to traditional class because there'd be a lot more schools subject to that.
And we know that's a decent model to have 4 per grade and having the 2 traditional and the two DLI, but I just want to point that out because we still have struggles
It's
in
not
the
exempt
traditional
from haves
classroom.
and have-nots, yep.
Yeah, and so that when we talk about the haves and have-nots, it's typically, I'm sorry, but it's typically those parents who are involved in their child's education that they're in that classroom. And I will say, I have seen the last few years a little bit of a switch, that the parents are no longer, oh, my kid, if I'm involved, my kid's going to be in the DLI. They are starting to look at, okay, is this the right thing for my kid? And so it is making me a little bit relieved seeing, okay, those traditional classrooms are kind of turning around, but then that's where I look at our DLI enrollment dropping, because whereas before some of these DLI programs had waiting lists, we now are struggling to get kids into that program. So
I think it's fair to say that we're up against some socioeconomic challenges that can be associated with DLI as well.
for sure. Sorry, Julie, go ahead. I'm done.
In my own school board practice and prioritization, I've been really, I don't know, just feeling really bold about literacy and very frustrated at how hard it is to move the needle on literacy. And recently I went skiing with some friends and they said, Julie, we brought you up here because we want to talk you into creating a ski class for Olympus High. And I said, I thought we were here because we're friends. That's super rude. But also, I said, well, you know what? When we have 100% literacy, I'll work on your ski program. Because I want everybody working on literacy.
Yeah.
I don't want them working on ski program. That is not the purpose of public education. So you're gonna have to hire your own private ski, whatever. You're not getting it for free from taxpayer dollars.
Did they buy you a chili cheese bread bowl by chance?
No, but we did go home after that.
Okay,
That was the last run of the day.
okay.
How is this like that? Is there a way in which these extra programs, there is value to skiing and learning to ski. It's awesome. And I would say there's more value to DLI and learning another language. Of course, there's more value to that. But I think overall we have to ask ourselves this question of how important is this when our mission is literacy?
Yeah, that prioritization, and what comes to my mind is the challenge of being a board member where you represent an area and constituents, but you also represent an entire school district as well, and trying to wrestle with that prioritization around what's best. Not easily solved.
That was not helpful.
No, yeah, I feel your pain.
We know the research is clear. There's cognitive benefits to students when they learn a second language, and they have more flexible brains, better problem solving. Also, we economically are advantaging students that continue the program throughout because they graduate bilingual, which is a marketable skill.
And benefiting our economy.
And I didn't include the slide. I think Spanish dual immersion has some extra added benefits as well, and I didn't include that slide this time around, but certainly in terms of parent and community engagement being much higher in the Spanish dual immersion, this two-way idea, this native speaker in that scenario has some added benefits as well.
think it's a big perception thing that we've seen too, and it's different for each respective community. And as we look at trying to communicate the effectiveness of these programs, market them, as it were, that's been a huge hurdle to overcome, is helping people realize there are added benefits to their kids being a part of that program.
I just want to say music does that too.
Yeah, yes.
But see, that's a great example. Like, there are so many programs that can do it. So I'm just devil's advocating here. I am dedicated to DLI. This makes a lot of DLI parents like really nervous when I'm talking like this. But I mean, I think it's important that we step back and ask ourselves the question, because there are lots of great things that our kids can be involved in that impact their brains, that will give them great skills. I think in the end, what it boils down to is, what do our people want? But I don't think that we can give anybody something that they want at the expense of somebody else and what they want. So we have to be able to somehow juggle all of these balls in the air at the same time. And what we're gonna have to do is we're gonna have to give PD on juggling. That's what I think is gonna have to happen.
Well, and I think, speaking to that, couple things. Yeah, you've hit the nail on the head. I mean, there is, name a decision you make as a board member that's going to please everybody. And that's one of, like, when you onboard, people who are coming in, it's like, just know, no matter how much you study an issue, no matter how many people you talk to, someone's going to be elated that, they feel listened to, they feel heard because you voted on their side. Consequently, sometimes, people say, oh, you didn't listen to me or you didn't hear me. And you have to literally be able to say, I heard you, I just disagree, and took a different, decision or different vote. So yeah, I think juggling is a good analogy, to kind of visualize that I don't see in this plan 500 kids dropping from the sky that's going to all of a sudden boost our enrollment, right? So I think what Rick is really getting at here is, look, we have forecasted a declining enrollment, and we've got to do something because status quo is not good enough, right? This is more of a generalized question. Are you just looking for us to kind of give a thumbs up to say, we're okay with you pursuing this recommendation? Is that, maybe that's more of a question for Rick, I don't know who wants to take that question, but is that kind of, are we, and I'm not cutting off anybody who has additional questions. All my questions have been answered, and personally, I'm comfortable pursuing this, but is that what we're trying to get to tonight?
Yes, also recognizing that it could be an agenda item in a future regular board meeting if the board wanted to take action on it. I would suggest that to make, in terms of a path moving forward, this is a path that we could pursue administratively. We also recognize the board reserves the right to take it up under advisement and take action on it. So yes, we can and would plan on moving down this road unless the board otherwise wanted to have more discussion or make it a matter of board action.
We could bring it to land policy if that's it. Develop a policy around it that states exactly this, that if you fall into these criteria, this is the steps. So, Julie, did you have anything further?
I would like to have this accompanied with our, of how to keep our DLI programs, our schools healthy.
So along with this, does it include the PAC part? Does this take away, so we're just talking about the DLI program, but to discontinue, I just want to know about the if a school closes, can the DLI program go with that? Is that included in this, Or are we just talking about this?
I think your point where it starts is when we have these 4 criteria and we have schools, Monroe and Valley Crest, that fit these criteria, we know currently that that the PAC's taking a look at these schools as part of the 3500 corridor, and so it's lending itself to be part of that discussion. Let's say it was, Bacchus or something along those lines, that PAC wasn't looking at having conversations around consolidation. We would probably go the other route of a grandfathering look or just consolidation of the program and not just the school. So the answer is it depends on the situation, which route we take.
The other stands alone.
Get your microphone a little closer there, Connie.
The other recommendation, part of the criteria, stands alone if it's not included in the PAC, in a PAC study.
Yeah, if there doesn't appear, so consolidation really can have 2 halves to it. It's consolidation of the program and not the school, or perhaps the school. And in the case of Monroe and Valley Crest, because they're in that study area, consolidation of school may solve our DLI problem.
Don, did you have something to add?
No, I think Rick did a good job. I was just saying that they're not the same process. Sometimes they're very close and they run a parallel path, and sometimes they're divergent. So yeah, Rick is correct. They're not one and the same. They might be sisters, but they're not twin sisters.
But one is informing the other.
Sometimes.
Right. In certain situations, that would be helpful for PAC to know.
So I just had a couple questions, and hopefully they're fast answers. What is the out-of-boundary rate for non-DLI class or schools? You said that it's usually 35% special permit into a school. What is it? Do you know what that is?
We haven't pulled those numbers. So the 65-35 average that we're giving you are the kids in DLI, not the traditional side. But I would assume, and I feel fairly confident in this assumption, that the majority of the traditional kids are in boundary.
So I assume that's different depending also on the school.
Oh, no. I did compile those numbers and sent them to you late this afternoon, so we do have that.
Okay.
In and out on traditional.
Okay. Do we have any that have done the regrouped? Have we tried that? Do we have any schools? And how successful is that?
Well, remember that one's not necessarily solving for one traditional. They have more than one traditional already, so they're using some regrouping to split the kids up a little bit so they have different looks. But yeah, we have several schools that leverage that, not across all grade levels, but for some grade levels. The challenge and the trick to all of this is it becomes such a puzzle depending on how many kids in every grade to what kind of variation you're going to do to solve. So yeah, we do see some regrouping happening depending on the size of the grade and the size of the school.
I'm just wondering if that would address maybe some of those other concerns that I just shared about the traditional classrooms tending to be the ones with the lower kids and being able to regroup them. I wonder if this is more of a model that we want to move toward, if we can find a model that works with those 4, the 2 DLI, 2 non, that if we regroup, it does address the issue of behavior, because it's true, when they're in there for 5 years together, they have behavior issues for both.
Yeah.
But also the lower, the lower kids, the kids who are lower in academics.
And I think most principals try and do that, share the wealth, if you will, right? So if you have some groupings of some students who have particular challenges, you don't tend to give them all to one of the teachers. You tend to try and balance that as much as possible.
I've just heard teachers say, or principals that I've talked to about it say, well, that's really difficult. They have to, because the way the DLI is set up, you have to reinforce in English what they learn in their DLI language, and so you can't just switch, but gosh, I'd really love to see them do that more often,
As much
just
as
because it
possible.
would address some of those other concerns that we've got.
Yeah.
So Sherry, I don't know if you can pass that on and just kind of maybe, I know it depends on the grade and I know, you know, what they're learning in that target language, but you know, like I say, seeing some of those teachers that have those low achieving kids that are in the traditional classroom is a concern to me.
The report that I am getting from William Penn, who does this, is that it really is great for the kids, but it's so hard on the teachers. And so they feel that, I mean, the teachers I've talked to, we're sending the message that they feel like their performance suffers because of trying to keep up with this. And so there's kind of this cost benefit, you know, balancing out the benefits situation going on there.
So Sherry's, like, I gave you this data, Rick. You could have answered that one, so she's pulled it up for me. So, you know, I'll give you an example at Valley Crest. Valley Crest percent in boundary here in 2024, and it fluctuates every year. For the DLI side, it's about 50-50 in boundary, out of boundary. On the traditional side, it's 65-45. So we do have, 65-35. That doesn't add up. 65-35. So, yeah, I was wrong in my inference that most of the traditional class kids are in that boundary. We do have in Valley Crest this year, we do have a number of students who are in traditional out of boundary. And Valley Crest is running a one traditional class in every class. And smaller, lower 20s class size on the traditional side.
Connie, did you have a question?
Yeah, I just was wondering, when you say in boundary, is it just within that school boundary?
School boundary,
So they're not
district.
necessarily out of the district boundary?
Correct.
But out of,
School boundary.
And that was 65-35 for non-DLI students, not the school as a whole.
For the traditional side, yeah. 50-50 on the DLI side, 65-35 on the traditional side.
How successful are multilanguage learners in adding in later in the program? Do we find, I don't know, Sure, if you can, if you have any.
Spanish is a little easy. The Spanish is the easiest. Chinese
Sure.
and French, the older along, very, very, very few. Sometimes you might have a move-in type of scenario, but very rare.
Do they find though, because I know they grade them on, like the Apple has them on the speaking, listening, and writing. Do they find if they add those multilanguage learners in later, are they lower? Are they too low on the writing side because they might get the language, the listening and speaking, but they don't get the writing, or do they catch up pretty well?
They catch up pretty well.
Do they?
If the student is a new arrival from a Spanish-speaking country and was fortunate enough to go to school in the country with which they came from, generally they fit right in, and it's nice that they have that half the day in their language and are able to continue academically.
Okay, thank you.
I mean, there's exceptions to everything, of course, but for the most part, they take a look at the students when they arrive at the school, do a few assessments, see where they fall and where they should be on the apple. Is this student seem to have the skills where the students, we typically say if they're within 2 grade levels of the apple proficiency targets, then they can catch up.
Okay. And Rick, I warned you that with the is it ARL?
ALC?
ALC. I never remember that. ALC, with the ALC program, do we bus the kids there from wherever they are?
Yes, we bus students to the ALC programs.
And is there also this same type of criteria? Do we move that if
No.
those?
The best way to think about an ALC program is like a special ed unit. They're housed in this, it's a district program. The students are identified at the district level for placement. We chose those locations because there was space available that could house the ALC programs. They could certainly be moved to another school if there wasn't space available to house them anymore. So it's like, it's a prescripted service for high ability learners.
I just wonder, just throwing ideas out, if we treated DLI like the ALC, is that, we couldn't do that? Or, I mean, could we do that? Is that a possibility?
I think it's conceivable, but it would be quite a shift in our model and would probably force some consolidation as well. Conceivable, but definitely a more significant shift than what we're recommending here.
I just want to throw that out there to maybe just put it in our minds that if we get to that point with these DLI programs, that maybe that is the way that we need to go, and it makes it more like what you're saying with the...
There'd be some transportation cost, but I mean, it's conceivable that it just would be perhaps another presentation entirely, just in how different it would be.
Like more of a magnet school, is that what you're, like a magnet program?
A
Well,
magnet program.
I don't know if that's been done anywhere else in the state, a magnet DLI program where the kids, you know, so the whole school is DLI basically, and you don't have to worry about the traditional side of that. I don't know if that's an option or if it's ever been done.
I think we've seen it in real small school districts. There's an example in a real small school district. But remember, ALC isn't, we've called it a magnet, but it also has traditional as well. So it's kind of a program housed where there's also traditional students as well. It's not just ALC at, say, Fox Hills.
And also, I'd point out that in an ALC program, we have a continual list of students waiting for placement, where you would reach a point with dual immersion in French and Chinese particularly, like you could not be adding kids. So you'd have attrition, but you wouldn't have that pool of kids that you're constantly generating through assessment to add to the program to keep it full.
It'd be more just like a waiting list, but not any kind of criteria, basically, except they're on that list.
Right, and really best practice after third grade would be you didn't put kids in dual immersion unless they were native speaker of the language.
Julie, did you have something else?
Yeah, I'd had a parent ask me this question, and I just think it would be good. I think we have a lot of DLI parents listening in. The question was, why not provide transportation for DLI and really invest in it and decide that this is important for us. So what we're going to do is invest in transportation so that we can provide it to all kids regardless of where they live, kind of in the idea of trying to make this not about haves and have-nots, but that we'll make sure everybody gets the opportunity. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, so similar to board president, it would just be a shift in how we've done business. The one thing that I wonder about with that is, again, like we talked earlier, we're stealing from ourselves. So what kinds of shifts would that mean? It's not a matter of we're gonna, although we could look to this, it'd be even farther out of the box, is we're gonna offer a bus in Salt Lake School District for anyone that wants to come to our DLI. If we did busing within, we would just be stealing from ourselves to a degree. And would that truly work, would be the questions.
I'm not suggesting we do it now. I'm just suggesting maybe this is, as we keep seeing the enrollment drop, or I don't know. I feel like we've got to address it. So anyway, Kim, go ahead.
Just a couple of additional questions on a slightly different track. And I'm sorry if you've covered this in the past. I don't think I've heard it before. What data do we have? Just, we've talked about the benefits, the cognitive benefits of DLI. I'm looking from the other side for a second. Just what data do we have about how DLI affects the learning of English for those who come to us speaking the target language? Like, does it slow down their learning of English? And then, in addition, so which subjects are taught in the target language only, and how does that affect academic scores for the students who are English speaking?
Let me answer the first half and then have you help me again with the second half. So in our presentation last year, that was one of the questions around, do we see DLI students underperform in their, in English type scenarios? And the answer was no. We don't see them underperform, but what we run up against is some different variables. I mean, earlier we hit on this socioeconomic variable around, generally around students whose parents opt them into DLI, and we know socioeconomics has a big correlation and perhaps even causation on student outcomes. So it gets tricky for us around identifying the variable and making adjustments for those, but I can say we don't see lower performance on the DLI side.
Okay, and then the second part of that was native English-speaking students who are in the DLI program, but are having certain subjects taught only in the target language. Does that affect their academic performance in those subjects?
No, they tend to perform just as well or better. But again, you run up, I mean, we could start teasing out variables from socioeconomics to teacher performance to a variety of things.
They do, just so you know, they do have to teach them the English equivalent, and that's why it's hard to do that complete integration with the other classes, because they're teaching them the same thing in English as well. So, am I right, Sherry? Is that?
They're reinforcing it.
Yeah, reinforcing, I'm sorry.
For just 20, usually about 20 minutes, so it's not a complete instruction in English, so they're just reinforcing perhaps some vocabulary that they need in English, or just, that's something that partners should work on together.
Yeah, because they have to recognize on the test that we have, the end of year testing, they have to recognize the word in English because they don't have it in Chinese or Spanish or French, so.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions?
I just have one more. So I just have the comment. Going along with what Nicole was saying is our charter schools do advertise. I mean, I've got postcards at my house that they're advertising, DLI types programs in their schools too. So I think we have to think about that when we are consolidating and doing these things, that we have charters that are competing for those students too, trying to do the same thing. So I just think in that area, especially that corridor, we have to watch those advertisements and make sure we're meeting that goal, I guess, of having a strong DLI for our schools to continue.
So it sounds like we're comfortable as a board with this recommendation as far as letting it remain at the school level until they start to reach these criteria. Without objection, I would say that we're going to give some direction that I think it's time that we step in as a district and say, unless it's a solid program, we have some concerns enough that we want to make sure things are going well. So I think this is the direction we'd like to go.
I agree with that, because if we left it up to the schools, they have nothing other than what they have in schools. So they need to go out and beyond in order to get the help that they need. So I think that it's not really Granite School District coming other than to just say, let us help. And I think it's a good thing.
I would like to reemphasize that I also would like this to have something that says, here's how we're going to keep our schools healthy.
My view is to advocate that we be specific in policy. Let's be specific and put the parameters around what this really looks like, so that there's no surprises
Got
from
that, Doug?
school to school.
Okay. All right. Any further discussion or questions?
Move to adjourn.
Right? Second. We have a motion and a second to adjourn.
Okay.
All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
All right. Can we get some WD-40 for the microphones?
Second.
That was not, particularly the ones up there too.
Put in a work order. No. Audio visual.
Yeah, your AP guys will do this.
Yeah.
They'll do some.
I'll get a work order.
They're on service.
Replacing will be the solution.
I'll get some WD-40 and I'll take care of this. Whatever. So Windex solves everything.
Can we get some different microphones then?
Gonna warranty to this,
That was amazing. So they can be aware. They'll be aware. Yeah, thanks for giving me that data. I was trying to have it all ready to go, but I'm not.